Feels like everyone and everything that live here have to have a certain degree of hardiness
Oh, for
and
sure.
resiliency. I think that strikes me a lot about the county. It's everyone's connection to the land and the seasons, but also just the grit that it takes to stick out the seasons.
Yeah, I've said it a lot, but it's easier to live somewhere else. So the people that live here on purpose.
Totally.
And because of that, we've got a very, very strong community that supports each other. Throughout all of my youth, if there was ever a problem that someone faced, if a kid got sick and they didn't have insurance or a house burned down, the community came together to fix that. Like we were each other's insurance. These are stories of outdoor adventure and expert advice from folks with calloused hands. I'm James Nash, and this is the Six Ranch Podcast. The Six Ranch Podcast is brought to you by Sig Sauer. SIG is a leading provider and manufacturer of firearms, electro-optics, ammunition, air guns, and suppressors. For over 250 years, Sig Sauer Inc. has evolved and thrived by blending American ingenuity, German engineering, and Swiss precision. Today, Sig Sauer is synonymous with industry-leading quality and innovation, which has made it the brand of choice amongst the U.S. military, the global defense community, law enforcement, competitive shooters, hunters, and responsible citizens. Sig Sauer is also a premier provider of elite firearms instruction and tactical training at the Sig Sauer Academy located in New Hampshire. For more information about Sig Sauer and its complete line of products, visit sigsauer.com. You've put in what I would say is a gargantuan amount of effort into this place.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Which is the Wallowa Lake Lodge.
This old gal.
Yeah. Tell me about her.
Well, she'll be 100 next year, so we're gearing up for a big centennial celebration, which means different things to different people, but one of our focuses is going to be inviting all the staff that have ever worked here to come for a big reunion and a barbecue, probably in late summer. I know that I'm constantly hearing from people in the community about their time working at the lodge. There was like kind of the glory heyday of the 70s when all of these, I think it was like a bunch of college girls lived here on the third floor. They shared one bathtub, I think, is the stories I've heard, and they called it Bat Haven because there were just bats galore up there. And they would party at the lake during the day and then go and serve in the dining room at night. And that was a very normal thing to do for a lot of local ladies. And I still hear about it. And I just find that super charming. So hopefully we can get the word out kind of across the Pacific Northwest and let people know that we're doing this big reunion. And then because of our founding year being 1923, I'd like to do sort of a living history weekend. I have a little bit of a pipe dream of doing a like 1920s car cruising, Model A, Model T.
Yeah.
It's a pretty niche group, so I don't know how much participation we'll get, but it's been fun to plan. So
I saw a Model T on Sunrise Road this year. I just saw a rig that was broke down, and there's enough tourists that come through here and they look for the first back road they can find. They're like, oh my gosh, it's gravel. And, I thought, well, you can figure it out. And then I looked a little closer and I was like, oh, that looks a little bit more interesting. I'll go over and see if they need help. And it was a high school kid from Pendleton who had found this Model T in a barn someplace, and almost everything on it was original.
Whoa.
And looked original. Like, it wasn't in great shape. He'd driven it over from Pendleton, and he had the whole back of it full of every fluid that the vehicle needed because it was leaking everything.
Oh my God.
And it had overheated there on Sunrise on a very mild uphill grade. And I was like, well, can I help you? Do you need anything? And he's like, no, I'll just put some more antifreeze in it and we're off to the races.
What?
It's like, good for you, kid. So it was like his high school shop project.
Wow.
Was, getting this thing to run. It had the original wheels. This whole thing was rusty. Like some of the upholstery was still in there. It's incredible.
That seems like a really ambitious journey to take.
Sure.
He went through like cabbage and everything?
Yeah.
Just trekking
presumably, unless he came over tollgate.
Either way.
Yeah.
Oh, you gotta love the chutzpah of youth. That's amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so 1923, it was built. I would almost go so far as to characterize this lodge as cliche, except that it's original. Like if this was built in 1970 or any time after that, you would feel like it was cliche, like it was, modeled after somebody's idea of a lodge. But being built when it was really kind of at the beginning of what lodges could be. And in 1923, Wallowa Lake, this was just a spot, it wasn't a destination. It wasn't known. People weren't traveling. So it was a pretty ambitious thing to build this here.
Totally ambitious project, but I disagree in that I think Wallowa Lake was kind of a spot at that time.
Was it really?
And I don't purport to be any sort of grand historian of this area.
Yeah.
I've just, as general manager here, done a lot of digging into the history of this thing, and I'm always finding out more. So I'm obviously going to put out my little warning that some of this information may be slightly incorrect or anecdotal or just out there. But from what I understand, this was a destination as early as the kind of mid-teens, and people would take the boat across the lake, and we have pictures of those.
Because there was not a road coming around here?
No, not a solid enough road as far as I understand. I've heard stories about when they were reintroducing the elk to this region and bringing them over on the railroad and then taking like mule teams through the backcountry.
Yeah, so they ended up taking them to Billy Meadows in the northern end of the county. I actually used to live out at Billy, so I know a little bit about that. But they brought them from Jackson, Wyoming on trains, and then they put them in cages on skis. So there was one elk per cage, and then these horses and probably some mules. What I've seen in the photos were horses, if I remember correctly. They sledded them out to Billy Meadows, and there was 5 to 6 feet of snow in the photos that I saw. So it was just tunnels, basically, that they were dragging these elk out there in. And then they had a fenced pasture that they kept the elk in for a while to make sure that they hadn't brought in any disease or weirdness, and then kicked them loose. There was probably still some elk in the Blue Mountains, in Hell's Canyon, in the Eagle Caps. It would be very difficult to say that there were no elk left at that time, but numbers were definitely down. And so that's how elk were brought back here. And then, interestingly enough, elk did very well here. And elk from this area that were hybridized with our local resident elk that still existed with the Jackson Hole elk were trained again to Astoria and kicked loose there.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Right. So this starts getting complicated because the Westies are very proud of the quote-unquote Roosevelt elk.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Where there's not a lot of genetic distinction between the two. And then a lot of the features that people point to show the difference between a Rosie and a Rocky, like antler coloration, that comes from the vegetation that they're rubbing with their antlers. Then there's the body size, but there's not really strong science to support that their body sizes are different per age. So it's pretty complicated about whether the Roosevelt is actually different from the Rocky anymore, or ever was.
And that makes a lot of sense too, because a lot has to do with habitat, right? Like if
Totally.
you're out in the sagebrush and everything's really dry over not centuries but decades, color patterns and bodily characteristics will be different from critters that are living in the deep rainforest.
In their, they're shedding their hair twice a year. So how much sun is interacting with that hair? If they're out in an environment where the sun's hitting them all the time, of course their hair is going to be lighter in color, right?
Totally.
So is ours.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me, but I think any opportunity to support that east-west divide in the Pacific Northwest
Absolutely.
We're ready to chomp onto that. But the elk here at the lake are part of our greater history, and it's one of the parts of the history that people get really fired up about, and I had actually a really interesting experience with this over the last year. So I'm sure with these bull elk they must have come down from Billy Meadows, and they kind of took up residence at this end of the lake. And there was Tarzan and Taft. I forget which one was the father and which was the son, but they were both massive. And they lived around here, and we have pictures of them. And they would fight and just have these like colossal antler crashing battles. And eventually, now I'm so scared I'm going to get this wrong, but I believe the son killed the father, and then something happened to the son.
How biblical.
Right. I mean, really an epic saga up here. And something happened to the son. He was eventually dispatched in some way, and we have some of their sheds up here, and then I believe the LeGrand Elks Lodge has another set of sheds. And I mean, we looked into it at one point, and if the sheds that we have were compared with the world record, it would be in the top 5.
Yeah, that bull is incredible. I would like to get a cape and a mannequin and turn that into a shoulder mount.
Well, there's more. So let me tell
you.
There's
more.
So
but wait.
There's more. There's more to this story. So I split my time between Wallowa County and the west side, and I was in the Tualatin Cabela's with my son, and we were just tooling around. I don't know what we were looking for. We regularly go to visit the taxidermy collection of Cabela's.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, it's quite the outing. And my son was like, Mom, look at that big elk. And I look up, and we're just in a random part of the store, not the main display. And there's a full elk mount sitting on top of this shelf. And I look at the sign, and it says, "This is Tarzan from Wallowa Lake." And then I became obsessed with mounting a campaign, haha, pun, to try to get that back. And so that's a plan that we're working on to try to figure out obviously it's the property of the store, but how the heck did that end up at the Tualatin Cabela's of all places? And as far as I know, that's the only full body evidence of Taft or Tarzan.
There's a good chance that those antlers are reproductions, and that the mount itself is from a different elk, the hide is from a different animal.
You're ruining the entire vision for me. This is like Christmas morning. I gotta believe it's original. Over 100 years later. Come on.
It could be. The skin almost certainly is not, right? If it looks good at all.
Yeah, what's the shelf life for taxidermy skins?
Depends on how well they're preserved, which unless it was in a museum, glass case type deal, the stuff from the 20s, it doesn't look good. That's more of the Imnaha Tavern style stuff.
Classics.
Beautiful
classics.
Don't look good, though.
A pageant of beauty.
Yeah. There's actually some anecdotal stuff around those bucks that they were a subspecies that no longer exists. So the old timers,
inbred weirdos,
not necessarily inbred, but we do have the characteristics geographically here of an island. So whenever you have that, you've got what it takes to develop subspecies.
Okay.
So you've got a special climate, you've got special terrain, you've got physical boundaries on all sides that prevent migration. Even today, the state considers there to be two different sort of classes of mule deer in Oregon, one which migrates and one which does not, and they separate that by the interstate. So if it's north of the interstate, they say that's a non-migratory group of mule deer, and the rest of the state's mule deer tend to migrate distances. Now ours do migrate, but it may only be a few miles because those miles mean many thousands of feet of elevation change.
That's fascinating. So what you're saying is basically like this pocket that we're in Wallowa County is like the Madagascar of Oregon.
Somewhat, yeah. Yeah. Or Tasmania. You know, you can really think of it as an island, and the Eagle Cap Wilderness itself is a batholith mountain range. So it's not a big fault line that runs, latitudinally or longitudinally. It's a tooth jutting up out of the ground, and it acts like an island. Because of that, we have all of the animals here that exist elsewhere in the Rocky Mountains, but they don't exist elsewhere in Oregon. So, we've got moose, we've got big Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, we've got mountain goats, we've got mule deer, we've got whitetail, we've got all of the species. And if you go away from this little pocket, from this island, elsewhere in the state, then you lose some of those species.
I first came to Wallowa County in 2011, and I was an interpretive park ranger with state parks, and we did a presentation that was about this area having the most diverse predatory population or predator population in the whole state, and there really weren't a lot of other places like it, because at that time it had just been confirmed that we had wolverine in the Eagle Caps, which I think had been kind of a myth for a while, and then it was proven to be true. The wolves had been reintroduced, so it was a really exciting time in terms of just the diversity that existed here with our wildlife.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. The Wolverine thing, I still have questions about. That.
Well, you should ask the people, because they came. So we do a lecture series here every Thursday in the summer, and we have a variety of people come and talk. It would be very cool if you wanted to come and talk sometime.
Yeah, no, I'd love to.
And we just cover all kinds of topics, geology, history, ecology, biology of the area. And the Wolverine folks, because it is like kind of a one to two man team, came down and showed their photo evidence and explained the tracking of their main male Wolverine, and then some of the others that they've identified. So I'm a believer. I think it's definitely happening, but I'm curious what your questions are.
Yeah. So I had a gentleman on the show, last summer maybe, or longer ago, and we talked about moose. He was one of the leading moose biologists in Alaska, and he's a fine gentleman. We did a great podcast about moose, and I went moose hunting that fall. Unfortunately, that winter he passed away.
Oh, shoot.
And his wife was the one who came down here to do the Wolverine studies and was the first one to get pictures of Wolverines. After he passed away, she listened to his voicemail until that was shut off, and then she reached out to ask if she could get a copy of the podcast so that she could hear her husband's voice.
Wow.
Yeah.
Shoot.
Yeah. Pretty incredible. But he's a fine gentleman, and that was a great show. He's got a couple books out, so he's got a legacy that can live on in a few different ways there for
That's
his
really
life's
cool.
work. Yeah. So when I'm looking at some of these boards and beams, it looks like I see a lot of saw marks in this wood. I like that.
Yeah, I was going to tell you, and kind of going with the history of what was happening down at this end of the lake. I forget the names of the original developers, but these folks came and they created a sawmill at this end of the lake to process all that timber. to build the lodge.
Wow.
And I mean, it's a really old school craftsman style. A lot of people come here and ask if we were part of the WPA or the CCC, and we weren't, but similar design.
Because it was before that, right? Yeah.
It was before that, but in keeping with that general, like you were saying, almost cliche era of what a lodge should look like. And in my spare time, because I'm such a loser, I go to lodges for fun to check them out and see what they look like and how they compare to ours. And there was this big heyday in the 20s of lodges like ours being built all across the Pacific Northwest, and our style isn't too divergent from Timberline, which I believe was built in 28. I was up at Lake Quinault Lodge, which was built in 26. And yeah, it's just this kind of like hardy architecture, these sturdy beams. As far as I know, and again, someone could correct me, but our windows are original here. I mean, you can tell looking at them, like the wavy glass, it's pretty old school.
Yeah, you're either looking into the future or the past by the time light passes through these things.
Exactly.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah. And this side that we're sitting on was actually the addition. This was added in 26, and the other side of the building was started in 23. And then through the years, there have been a number of people who have owned the lodge. The main family that had the lodge for decades was the Wiggins, who are very cool people, and still a lot of them are local. And Janie Wiggins, who was the daughter-in-law of Irene Wiggins, who was the single mom that bought the lodge in the late 40s. She still remembers like everything that happened here and what they served and what the uniforms looked like. And at that time, the Wiggins really had kind of I call it a Coney Island empire up here. Like they had the marina, they had the Edelweiss building, which was at that time, I think, a skating rink, dance hall. They had ice businesses. I think they did horseback rides at one point. They kind of controlled everything in this area for a number of years. And it was kind of a crazy accomplishment to think about, because I just run this lodge and that's plenty for me. We get so many people in the summer and we have so much going on that it's just crazy to think about adding to that. But through the years, a bunch of different people worked on the building. It's the kind of thing that needs constant repair. We renovated our deck in 2021.
Beautiful deck.
Thank you.
Like those tables, like that deck a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, that deck's got all locally sourced juniper for the railings and the burls. And our maintenance director, Bob Lyon, was the main builder of the deck, and I had the super fun, weird job of basically being the GC on that project, which is really, really odd. But it was during a time when we had to source lumber from multiple spots because of the start of the pandemic and everybody was doing all their projects and prices were super high and supplies were scarce. And I'm just thrilled that we pulled it off. But we knew we wanted to expand our outdoor space, and it's been my kind of single-minded focus to make this lodge as accessible as it can be to the most amount of people, and especially our community organizations and partners. Just make sure everyone is very welcome here.
Yeah, and I'd like to congratulate you on the success of that, because there's been other folks who've attempted, tourist housing, I guess, here, who have done the opposite of that, who have really alienated themselves from the community and become less accessible. So I think it's admirable that you've achieved that thing, because it's not easy. It would be easier not to. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, it's a cool place. So, surviving a business through, some terrific storms up here, through, I'm sure there's been fires in the last 100 years that have ripped through the area and probably gotten really close to here. It's amazing that this structure is still standing, and not only standing, but like it's in great shape.
is in pretty good shape. We have constant work to do here. Like it's, we need to work on the siding. We've got to replace the roof, and that's a monumental project with a building of this size and of this era. But we did have a walkthrough with a contractor team in the spring to just kind of evaluate. And I remember our main contractor was just like, wow, the walls are really straight. That's a great sign.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, thank God for small miracles.
Yeah, and the floor is level.
Yeah.
It's not sinking. There's not a lot of 100-year-old foundations that, are as strong as this.
It's pretty stout. And we've got plans we've got a whole downstairs bar that we dream of reopening. For a long time. Our board managing partner, James Monteith, will talk about, it was called the Cowboy Bar for a while, and it was the only place you could get a drink at this end of the lake, and they served everybody. And then for a while it was the Badger's Den, because the guy that was the bartender called himself the Badger, and you were like down in this dark smoky hole under the main lodge. We've got this epic jukebox down there and these super old cash registers, and everybody dreams of reopening that bar, but I'm a bit of a pragmatist, and I'm like, hey folks, we've got a roof to put on before we can enjoy our speakeasy. So we operate our bar out of the lobby, and it kind of works. People get their drinks and they roam around, and they can go down to the watershed and hang out on the lawn, and we do music, and I think it ends up being a pretty convivial atmosphere, but there's high hopes for what we can do in the future.
Convivial.
Gosh,
I haven't dusted that one off in a minute. Do you have to pay extra for words like that?
Oh, I'm going to talk to my mom. Vocabulary is so important to me, and I've got 3 sons, and I remember when they were little, my oldest son would be like getting into it with his middle brother, and I would say like, hey, you're being very incendiary. Please stop. And people would look at me and roll their eyes and be like, oh my God, why are you talking like that to your kids? And I was like, no, this will pay off. And a couple years go by, and now my oldest son writes stories. He has this village that he's created that is modeled after Joseph, and it's called Hay Barn. And he writes books about Hay Barn. And his vocabulary is awesome. And he's 9. And I'm like, hey, if I can be proud of one thing, I'm going to be proud of this, because raising boys is no joke. I was going to tell you, I saw your sister at a chamber board meeting yesterday, and she had your nephews in tow, and I was just like, salute, because that is every mom of boys' worst nightmare, having to be in like a professional setting with your hooligan children. But oh my gosh, her kids were amazing.
They're good kids.
They were so well-mannered.
Yeah, they're doing pretty good.
That's really hard to pull off.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know anything about it because I don't have kids. But, yeah, hats off to the moms that manage to raise boys and girls. Yeah, y'all are doing good work. So is this a kid-friendly lodge? Can people come here who are families and bring kids in the summertime?
Totally. For a long time, kind of in the 70s through the 90s and early 2000s, the former owner-operators, I think, were trying to create a more mature environment here that was really more suited for the folks that would travel out to this area year-round and maybe were a little advanced in age. And it was not kid-friendly for a long, long time. But when I took over as GM in 2020, it was really important to me that kids were welcome here just as much as anyone else. And it brings a certain vitality and excitement. And kids can be pretty obtrusive, but they don't have to be. And usually when we get folks with families, like they want this to be their base camp, and then they want to go out hiking, horseback riding, mini golfing, hanging out on the lawn. And it just creates a really nice environment.
Yeah.
So absolutely, kids for sure. And the one thing we don't allow here, which we get a lot of flack for, is dogs. And I always explain to people that we did our conservation easement with the Nez Perce tribe in 2020, and part of that conservation easement is this goal of eventual reintroduction of sockeye to the lake. A lot of people know that we've got world record kokanee here, but kokanee are landlocked salmon, and we'd love to see sockeye make a comeback here. I know this is kind of a controversial issue for some people, but part of that is maintaining a quote unquote pristine environment in certain parts of the watershed and the property. So
what do you think is the controversy with bringing back sockeye?
I wouldn't even dare to touch it. I just know that when people bring it up, it can be kind of a heated issue with the dam being involved and kind of reversing. You would probably know better than I, but how long has it been that the dam has been in existence? More than 100 years?
No, less.
A little less?
It would be probably a lot less because the dam doesn't hold back very much water.
Okay.
The lake is a full pool, 290 feet, 300 feet deep. And I think the dam holds back like 17 feet of water or something like that right now. If it was a healthy dam that was repaired, it could hold back, another 10 feet or whatever. I'm off on some of these numbers, but it's not a lot, I guess is the point that I'm trying to make. If you repair or work on a dam in Oregon that they could have an anadromous fishery, you have to allow for fish passage one way or another. So that means that you either put in a fish ladder or like an elevator. And most of what I've heard is the elevator approach, which is like, I think they call it like capture and haul or something like that. So a fish would swim into a box in the bottom, and then they would haul this box and the water and the fish up to the top, kick them loose in the lake. It's a lot cheaper to build it that way, but you also have to have somebody to operate it in perpetuity. People are a little flinchy around bringing back species here because a lot of those have absolutely bit us in the ass. When wolves showed up here, and wolves were not brought to Oregon, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. And maybe it's just a slip of speech that people say, well, when we brought wolves back, we didn't. We did not bring wolves back to Oregon. No one did. But like a lot of Idaho residents, they realized that life was better here, so they crossed the river and came on over. That has not been a good thing for a lot of people in Wallowa County. For a lot of our wildlife in Wallowa County, wolves have not been a good thing. People are a little flinchy about spotted owls, even though they never lived here and still don't. We really saw the timber industry fail in the early 90s due to policies that were impacted by the spotted owl. So when you see something like the return of the sockeye salmon, that can be really, really powerful and great, getting those marine drive nutrients coming back. But then there's also residents and ranchers and stuff like that are like, man, I wonder if this is going to mean that, I have to change how I do business on my own property, or am I going to lose a grazing permit because of this? Or, if you're a recreational fisherman, they're like, oh, are they going to change regulations so now I won't be able to fish the lake for part of the year? I think there's just a lot of fear and unknowns. And some of that's because of the history of how natural resources have been managed in Oregon, and some of it's just fear of change.
What was your take on the reintroduction of lamprey, which seemed to be a pretty successful project? Was it last year?
So I've been begging the Department of Fish and Wildlife for lamprey for a decade. I think they're such a keystone species for white sturgeon in particular. My granddad, growing up down there at Doug Bar, when the Snake River would flood in the spring, where the airstrip is now, that was their hay meadow, and he would go out and pick up buckets of lamprey that were out there in the field. So they were incredibly common at that time. Really oily, high in protein and fat. They're slow moving and they move up the river bottom. So they were a perfect food source for the sturgeon. the sturgeon in Hell's Canyon are not doing well. They're not reproducing very well. And that's why there's strict regulations around how people interact with them. So you can't even remove a white sturgeon from the water down there. You can't even pick it up out of the water to take a picture of it because that reproduction is not going very well. We have smallmouth bass in there in a big way right now. So the food that would get down to the level of the river that the sturgeon are at often gets consumed by smallmouth before it can ever get there. And then one of these really critical food sources being the lamprey coming back up the river bottom, they have a really difficult time navigating the 90-degree angles that are on fish ladders, is my understanding. I'm not a lamprey guy, but the lamprey are not making it back upriver for a number of reasons. So I'm pro lamprey. I asked the Department of Fish and Wildlife for lamprey for years and years, and it tends to be the type of deal where it's like, oh, we need to do like a 10-year impact study and then blah, 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 and nothing ever happens. However, if you talk to the tribe, they show up with a 50-gallon bucket of water filled with lamprey on the back of a flatbed truck and tip it into the river.
Yeah. I thought that was pretty epic.
I love that. So yeah, I mean, we need a lot of work to get lamprey back, and it's going to take some pretty dramatic changes in river temperatures to have a successful return of sockeye salmon. Trying to get up the Grand Ronde in August when the water temperatures are lethal for salmon, that's an impossibility, right?
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, some of them are going to make it through 75-degree water. Like, no, they're not. So there's massive hurdles to get fish back here. And the dam is one of those, but it's not necessarily a field of dreams scenario where it's like, oh, we put in capture and haul fish passage, so now we can have sockeye returning. Well, I mean, if they can't make it back up the Columbia, the Snake, the Grand Ronde, the Wallowa to get here, I mean, it's 600 river miles from the middle of the Six Ranch to the mouth of the Columbia. So what, another, 25 miles to get here? That's a push with 8 dam crossings each way.
I'm reminded of that poem your dad wrote. He read at Fish Trap Fireside last month about the salmon, and it ends with him basically saying, after all those hurdles, it's interesting to think that the salmon would be threatened by a cow.
Yep.
But yeah, no, I understand a little bit of the major complexity, and that's why I hesitate to comment on it. But I know, the tribe is our partners here, and they're very interested in seeing that happen in a responsible way eventually. Who knows how long it's going to take, but
could take a climatic shift. There's a number of ways that it could happen. And then fish are pretty adaptive, There's sockeye that make it to, Redfish Lake in Idaho, and that's a lot longer swim than here. So it could happen. It'd be cool if it did. I think the splash dam logging had a big impact on sockeye. And splash dam logging, while it was short-lived, gosh, that would have been cool. Like, ecologically, yeah, not great, but I'm sure a lot of folks don't know what it is. But
are we talking about, like, the Sometimes a Great Notion style logging?
Actually, have not read any.
What? You gotta read that book. Oh, it's so good.
Yeah.
But yeah, I imagine, like, logging into the river and basically chaining giant trees and pulling them downriver.
It was a little bit like that. So they did it, I think, in the Mineham and maybe the Lostine, but they would build temporary dams, fairly large ones, and they'd log all winter long and deck their logs up alongside the river. And then when all the logs were decked up and ready to go, they would break this whole dam loose at once, and the surge of water would take the logs out.
Which doesn't sound treacherous at all.
But how fun. How fun to, like, can you imagine, like, being the ones, like, I get to, throw the stick of dynamite in there, or however they kicked it loose. It'd be so incredible. Like, that's every guy's dream.
I was going to say, you're sounding very guy right now. And, like, for me, I'm like, I don't know that I would want to be around that.
Oh, sounds amazing. I mean, you get to log all winter long, cutting trees, decking them up, and then you get to create your own tsunami. Badass.
Lumber tsunami.
But it was a bad deal for the fish, right?
Oh, how could it not be?
The fish.
I imagine for a host of other creatures as well.
Have you ever seen any of our ice outs break loose in any of these creeks around here?
No.
It's pretty interesting. So if we get a period of like 20 or 30 below that lasts for very long, the creeks all freeze up, especially big sheep. That's a great one. And after a period of warming and thaw, it'll break loose, and it does it all at once. And the ice just starts to move, and it scours out everything, takes trees with it. I can't imagine how fish survive that. And it's just a big surge of ice that ends up going out, and it's pretty cool.
Feels like everyone and everything that live here have to have a certain degree of hardiness.
Oh, for sure.
And resiliency. I think that strikes me a lot about the county. It's everyone's connection to the land and the seasons, but also just the grit that it takes to stick out the seasons.
Yeah, I've said it a lot, but it's easier to live somewhere else. So the people that live here on purpose.
Totally.
And because of that, we've got a very, very strong community that supports each other. Throughout all of my youth, if there was ever a problem that someone faced, if a kid got sick and they didn't have insurance, or a house burned down, the community came together to fix that. Like, we were each other's insurance.
Oh, completely. Were you there? I think I saw you at that pie sale.
Yeah.
For the Wallowa trap shooting.
I bought a $300 pie.
That was insane. I'm like, my mouth was just dropped open the entire time in shock. I remember people auctioning off paintings where I was like, okay, I see you, old school rural scene painting, and somebody's like $1,000, and I couldn't believe it. I'm from a small town too, but that sort of camaraderie and support is, I think, unique to this spot.
Yeah. So we raised enough money with that pie auction to send the entire Wallowa high school trap shooting team to nationals for 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And I think my $300 pie was like one of the cheaper pies of the night.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not that people are super wealthy here. They're not. Quite the opposite. But they're very supporting of each other. And that came into play with the lodge at one time as well.
Totally.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I was just talking with someone about that this morning because there's some momentum for regional economic growth initiatives, kind of a Main Street program we're trying to get off the ground in the county right now that would just help with grants and funding for building improvements, beautification, things like that in all of our communities. And I was telling the coordinator of that, I said, he was asking, are there any existing landmarks at the lake that you think would be good candidates for work, and why? And I said, I would be remiss if I didn't say the lodge and some of these big projects that we have that we need to accomplish. And I know there's support because, in 2015, the former owner-operator of the lodge died suddenly and very tragically. And his business partner, kind of financier situation, decided he was going to list the lodge in a sealed bid auction. And the community found out about this, and I gather from the story that at the time there were rumblings of Hyatt and Marriott buying the property, demolishing the lodge and building vacation condos in this area. And the community found out and was just absolutely horrified, banded together very quickly to form an LLC and raised enough money from private contributions to put a down payment to stop the lodge from going to auction. And the LLC was formed. And so we are owned today by over 120 shareholders. A lot of them are local. A lot of them are throughout the Pacific Northwest. Everybody has a strong sentimental tie to this building, and they can tell you their history of coming here or celebrating their 16th birthday here in 1952. You know, everyone has a story, and they put up that money to stop the lodge from being sold, and then kind of said like, okay, what next? And so I answer to a board of 7. About half of them are local and half of them live other places in Oregon. And it's just been our continued goal to keep making the lodge successful and be a community resource for whoever needs it. And it's not an easy thing to do. We're a seasonal business. We are only open the end of May through the end of September. We have an absolute breakneck, crazy busy season like so many people in the county. I always call summer the stack and cheese time. It's not, as you know, it's not uncommon for a lot of people to be working 3 jobs in the summer and then just stop once we get to fall. But we go really, really hard for those 4 months. It's been my goal to build out our shoulder season and start working with a lot of private events, doing conferences. Last winter, we worked with Wallowa Alpine Huts and hosted a number of backcountry ski groups, which was really fun and a nice way for us to kind of keep business rolling through the winter without having to have our whole team here, which can be, last summer we were up to 44 employees.
You don't allow dogs, but you'll allow backcountry skiers?
Oh, yeah. I mean, different breed. They were pretty, I got to say, the skiers were great to have around. They were really fun, and it just blew my mind that there were so many people that were skiing at that level. Like, most of these guys and girls were AVI trained, ready to go.
Oh, you got to be.
Deep backcountry. They were telling me, oh, we got sick of, having to wait in the lift line, and sometimes we do, like, helicopter drop-off skiing. But if we can't do that, then we come out here and go up to Wing Ridge. And I'm just sitting here like, I tried to learn how to ski last winter at 32 and found it to be quite the daunting task. So I'm impressed by people who can build their skill level. Yeah.
Now, there's I think the lack of skiing here is really what's saved Wallowa County from becoming other places. Thank God for that. That and... like we talked about, it is tougher to live here. Every time it snows, the interstate's closed, the grocery stores run out of food. You're stuck here. You're very much here. Last winter, the sheriff's department was, out delivering oxygen to people on snowmobiles during winter storms. Like, it's tough. So people come here in the summer and they come, maybe here to the lodge and they're like, oh my gosh, what a place. I'm moving here. And, they're like, wow, real estate's crazy expensive. Let's buy it anyways. And then, come February when they haven't seen the sun in a couple months and, haven't been able to buy a loaf of bread for 2 weeks, they're like, yeah, I'm going back to Bend, going back to California.
Oh, dirty words. Look at you. Yeah. And I mean, we could talk about housing in the county if we want to get real dry, but
nah,
it's a debacle. It's for sure. It's a big, big issue. But yeah, you got to be dedicated to live out here. And some interesting conversations I had this summer with folks that were coming out, though. Like, I'm from a small grass seed town in the mid-Willamette Valley, right at the edge of the Santiam Canyon, so big timber country. I went to Scioto High School, home of the loggers.
Scioto Loggers.
Yep.
There were some big old boys on their football team that I remember. You guys were orange, weren't you?
Orange and black. And really, I'll get totally in trouble for saying this, but like historically, from my knowledge, not much of a football school, major wrestling school.
Yeah.
Like, we clean the floor as wrestlers.
Until you came up against an Enterprise Savage. But your football team had some big dudes. I remember that.
Oh, deep diss.
But, as far as wrestling, I mean, you just kind of paled in comparison.
I mean, I feel like we'd have to look at some stats. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but I do remember being in FFA every year, and I went to Scioto because they had FFA. My hometown school did not. I remember every year the state officers would come, and every year there was someone from Union or Wallowa County. And I'm like, how is this possible? This is a tiny part of the state.
Yeah.
And every year they've got a state officer coming through. So, I mean, there's something in the water out here for sure.
There's something in it in Scio for sure as well.
Yeah, Scio, I'm proud to be from that area. And, when I came back out to Wallowa County, I get occasionally accused of being from Portland, and I get real salty real quick when that accusation flies.
Well, if it's west of Pendleton, it's Portland.
Oh, for Pete's sake. It is so not, though. Like, if you're from the Santiam Canyon, if you're from Scio, it's like the ideology is so much more like Eastern Oregon than any part. Oh, but that's what I was going to say. So people would come out here in the summer from places like Forest Grove or Boring or freaking Malala. And they're saying, like, we feel trapped in this area that we live. Like, none of these values in the greater I-5 corridor represent us. And we want to live in a place where people are a little more like-minded. And then I get on my high horse, as someone who can barely shovel snow. I'm a real weenie when it comes to the snow. And I'm like, hey, well, yeah, if you want to live here, that's great. But it is a commitment, and you've got to be really dedicated. And weather's all over the place. Supply chain can be pretty crazy. It can be really hard to find a place to live. And they're looking at me with these desperate eyes and saying, like, hey, we'll take that over a homeless person rifling through stuff on our front porch, or some of these other issues that are happening in more urban areas in Oregon.
I say fix your own house. I just can't discourage people from moving here enough. I understand that there's problems elsewhere. There's problems here too, but I just would really like to discourage anyone from moving here as firmly as I can.
Yeah, the fix your own house is a really strong, super valid statement. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. There's always going to be issues. Oregon is in kind of a state of flux right now, and we need a lot of help, but it's also like localized, different help for different areas.
Sure.
It'll be interesting to see what happens with this election. Oh no, it got political. I'm sorry. I get very jazzed about politics, even though I shouldn't have an official opinion.
Yeah, it's the nature of it to get people jazzed up. In reality, very little changes.
That's true. Like, but does it not change because we're not doing enough? I like micro issues, right?
I didn't mean to put a quarter in that machine.
Yeah, it's going to get really fired up. I mean, just take like micro issues. Like, what can you do to fix little issues where you are? And maybe a micro issue seems really daunting at first, but slowly with time and effort. What did my friend, I was having dinner with a friend last night. He's a writer. And he said, there's nothing more powerful and dangerous than a bold and motivated mind. I don't know if he was quoting someone, but I loved that.
That's so untrue. I mean, it's hallmarky. I get that, but that comes from a place of a lot of comfort. Like, that's the most dangerous thing. That's the most powerful. Get real.
Okay, you're a cynic. I'm just saying, think big. I mean, though, that's kind of what we had to do here. It felt like in the beginning, like, odds were so stacked. It was like nobody wanted to come use the lodge. They were afraid to even walk through the front door. They would come in and act like it was a library, like hushed tones. Can I bring my child here? Like, it was bizarre.
Well, it had been, not used by locals for a long time. I don't think I ever came in here until I was in my 30s.
A lot of people tell me that, and a lot of septuagenarians tell me that. Like, and that to me is kind of a failure from the lodge end, right? Like, you have this old cool thing. My 9-year-old son said this really well. I was so impressed. He said, the lodge is Wallowa County's heirloom.
Yeah.
And I was like, dude, that's perfect, because it is. It's been passed down through the years and hopefully continues for a lot longer, and is something that people continue to use, continue to enjoy, and continue to feel like it's theirs and they have some claim to it.
What kind of roof you going to put on it?
Dude, I would love to put a metal roof on this thing, but I don't know the basics of even getting that project funded are priority number one. And then we'll talk about what kind of material. I mean, I think it'll probably end up being just like a standard shingle roof, but I would love to do metal because it would just make a lot more sense in the long run.
Yeah. I debated between metal and shingles on my house, and we ended up going with shingles. One of the drawbacks of metal in this country, especially up here at this end of the lake, when your snow and ice comes off, it comes off all at once in
Just
a big avalanche.
Dam, yeah.
And it can be pretty destructive to everything around your building, and then to the screws and stuff like that. But yeah, I don't know. Some of these new shingles are pretty cool.
Okay, I'll do some digging and look into the new shingles. We haven't even begun the process yet of trying to figure that out because it's kind of all hands on deck for the centennial right now. And
I mean, and any of that stuff can feel overwhelming, like you're talking about. So you just have to, bite off what you can and work on that.
Totally.
One of the things I would like to work on, coming back to it, is finding a cape and a mannequin for that bowl.
Well, please be my guest. I mean, I feel like the more the merrier. There's definitely room. We could get it. I would even probably let you borrow it if you were really ambitious enough to take that on.
I don't need to do that, but if I think I can come up with a cape if I try to in the next year, and then we'll talk to some of our local taxidermists and see if we can't get a little community-based project going on.
That sounds like a plan.
Yeah, that'd be pretty neat because it is a spectacular animal. Yeah, that'd be fun. Okay, and then we also need to raid the Cabela's in Tualatin and steal an entire elk somehow.
Yeah, if you've got ideas on how to do that, get a hold of me. Greater listenership. Yeah. I would love any suggestions that don't involve a fly-by-night back alley trailer operation, because we've got to try to get that back over here. I just think that would be amazing.
That would be cool.
A relic of the past inside another relic of the past.
That might be a good task for the Elks Lodge here to work on.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to talk about the history of this place. I think it's pretty neat, pretty spectacular. Yeah.
Thanks for coming by.
I like the saw marks.
Yeah. She's old and she's vibrant. She's going to keep on kicking yet.
Good job.
Thank you.
What I remember is getting up in the dark, shuffling on out to the pickup and climbing in, heading out, headlights going out over the fields and the roads and getting back into the mountains and the timber, and knowing that there was a destination out there that I was going to be sharing with my dad. And at some point, either during the drive or once we got out to some ridge that we were going to be watching when the sun came up, you'd hear that little squeak of the lid coming off of the thermos. And then you unscrew that top part a little bit, pour that coffee or hot chocolate into a cup, and you can just see the little tiny vapors of steam coming off of it, curling up into the morning, and holding on to that thing like it was a prayer, and blowing some of the heat off of it and taking that first hot drink in the morning, and then the same thing that evening, because if there was anything left, it was still going to be hot. Like, those are core memories. Those are part of growing up and part of being an adult, and then sharing that. Now, I'm getting to share that with my nephew and giving him those experiences. And it's an accessory to the experience. But part of what I remember about hunting and working with my family as a little kid was that there was this green, beat to hell, still going strong Stanley thermos. And now there's a complete line of Stanley products out there. And if you go to stanley1913.com, you can look into those and see if there's something out there that you need, or that you want or that you would like to give to somebody else. And if you use the discount code 6RANCH, the number 6 and the word ranch, and you can get 25% off of just about anything in their store. I encourage you to do it. They're great supporters of this show. They're great supporters of this audience. I love you guys. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for all of your support and your attention. We're not stopping. We're going strong. And I'm glad to pass along this discount to you guys. And I hope that you find something that can help develop that core memory for you and the people that you love. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share the show with a friend. You can also rate the podcast and leave a review. Your support allows me to keep doing what I love, which is meeting incredible folks and sharing their stories with you. For more content and photos, follow the show on Instagram at 6Ranch Podcast or me at 6Ranch Outfitters. This episode was produced by Emily Brannigan, with original music written and performed by Justin Hay. Art for the 6Ranch Podcast was created by John Chatelain and digitized by Celia Christofferson. Tune in every Monday for a brand new episode of the 6Ranch Podcast. I'll catch you next week.